Good day, I'm Helena Taddesa. Thank you so much for joining us today on a conversation on mental health. Joining me today is Ms. Bilan Araya, who is a therapist in community mental health. Bilan? Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on here and have this conversation. It's such a timely conversation for what's going on in our community, and I believe a very important one. I'd love for you to just introduce yourself before we begin.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Helena.
Of course.
So I'm Bilan Naraya, and I immigrated to the U.S. when I was 10 years old with my family as a refugee after spending 2.5 years in Sudan. So this particular war that's taking place currently is very dear to my heart, and I felt it important to be here as a Tigrawati and also as someone who knows something of the refugee experience and the impact of war firsthand. So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much. I think I'm very clear we all know how devastating everything is. And I believe without being cognizant of our mental state individually and collectively as a community, in all that we're doing, our advocacy, be it our for our culture, for our families, it won't go far without paying attention to what's happening to us personally. I think my stance on it. While talking to some of my friends and family and colleagues about doing this program, one of the things that came up consistently was, we need to continue to galvanize. We need to continue to work, push hard on getting our elected officials and the world to see what's going on, which is actually the most, one of the most important things we could be doing right now. But I couldn't help but wonder how many of us take our mental health or understand how important it is in order to do that work. And also, I'd like us to have this conversation today, understanding this other context that inevitably there will be people who are within the country right now facing firsthand turmoil and ethnic profiling and just horrific things that they never thought they'd see again or see for the first time. I want us to keep these things in mind as we have this conversation so that we're able to reach, that saying, even if we reach one person that's facing this, it's so important to start this dialogue, and it's just an honor to have it with you.
Oh, thank you. And I couldn't agree more. It is more important than ever right now to be thinking about our mental health, both as, people in the diaspora and then obviously those who are directly impacted. Thank you for bringing this conversation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So let's kick it off by defining some words. Let's get into the terminology. 3 words that I'm very interested in right off the bat: mental health, trauma, PTSD.
Okay, those are good.
Pretty specific, right?
Okay. We can start with mental health. Okay. So mental health is generally just in reference to the condition of someone's psychological, emotional, and mental well-being. So it's just in the same way that when we talk about physical health, we're referring to the physical experience. Mental health addresses the mental well-being or the state of mental well-being. And sort of, if all is well, which it isn't currently, but if all is well, then the person in question would sort of be able to realize their potential, right? And can cope sort of with the normal stresses of life, work productively, contribute to community pretty fairly easily. And that's the goal. Like, we want to achieve optimal mental health. And so that's mental health in a nutshell.
Perfect. Let's define trauma.
All right, so trauma is an emotional response to something, to an experience that's like greatly distressing or disturbing. So that's, and it can encompass a lot of experiences. Right? So everything from a car accident, right, to war. Trauma happens when what we're experiencing is greater than our capacity to deal with it, to cope, to be able to navigate it. So that trauma lets us know that what we're experiencing, we're going to need more resources than ourselves.
So out of the norm.
Out of the norm. It's definitely when it's sort of, you don't necessarily have to have an existential crisis around it, but it feels like a threat to your existence, right? So it's yeah, very much out of the norm. There are different types of traumas, everything from acute trauma to chronic trauma to complex trauma, but what they all have in common is it is definitely out of the norm, and it's greater than you can go it alone. So it's important to like pull resources and be intentional about recovery.
So now let's define PTSD. I know we've heard it here and there.
Mm-hmm. So PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, it's the mental health condition, and it results from a traumatic event, right? So the event has passed, as far as the clear and immediate danger has passed, but the impact is still with you. And this often results in when it hasn't been addressed properly, right? So you're still operating in some ways like you're still in active trauma, but it's after the trauma. So it's far from pleasant, and it can greatly hinder progress in all of its forms and relationships and just well-being in general. Yeah.
Perfect. In having a conversation with you the other day and wanting to flesh out how our conversation with each other for our viewers today would go, we chose to focus in on within mental health, trauma, and PTSD within the context of the individual, the collective, and secondary trauma. So, because this is such a vast, I think once we get started, there's so much ground to cover, but for today at least, and I will coax you to come back, but at least for today, I'd like to go ahead and jump in on the individual, right? So, and again, we all know what's happening. So, to you who may be watching this and you are experiencing this firsthand, I can't go any further without saying that we see you, we are advocating for you, we are calling and crying and shouting and everything under the sun. We see you and we want you to take care of yourself, and it begins here. This is something to help you gain control. And I may not be saying that right because I'm not a therapist, but that's how I'm feeling. I want to express this to you. To you who are in the field with a lot of us who are doing the advocating, this is important for you because right now you may be sitting there thinking, I need to be tweeting right now, I could be calling officials, but until your mental health is at least on the forefront of one of the things that you're checking off, you'll be pooped out very quickly. So then comes the guilt and all that. So in order to continue doing what we're doing, we have to focus in on our mental health. So having said that, on the individual level, what does trauma look like on the individual level? So let's say to someone who may be within the country right now dealing with this, who's watching this, what is it that we've defined already what it is, and how is it? How does it show up for that person who may not even realize they're having a traumatic experience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because in the midst of trauma, it can be difficult to be able to think, much less reflect, right? So I want us to sort of be mindful of that, right? That is the impact of trauma, is to sort of do away with our faculties in a sense. So, but there are some telltale signs, right? So if you're not able to sleep, if you're having intrusive thoughts that are just rampant, right? Or, you know, and depending, and this isn't only exclusive to children, but physical ailments are also a sign of trauma, right? So you may just have like headaches, nightmares, fatigue, joint pain. It can show up in a variety of ways. And that's as you're in it, right? And it doesn't, again, those symptoms don't necessarily go away once you're out of the woods in a sense, but to be mindful that, wow, I can't sleep, I can't think, I'm not able to get anything done. Things that were relatively easy to me before, whether that's eating or like loss of appetite, it's one of the main ones, right? And so if you're anxious, on edge, you're hypervigilant, and it seems that even when quote unquote you're safe, like you may know that like, all right, I'm not in any area that is like where there's active, you know, gunfire or something, but you still kind of jump and you're really startled. Those are all part of what it means to be experiencing trauma. But as I said, it's hard to be reflective when you're in it. So often a lot of people may not know, because their body goes into survival mode. And so then they may be dissociating, where they're sort of thinking ahead and separating from parts of themselves in order to just get through. So if you notice that, wow, there's some hours in a day or moments in a day where it's unaccounted for, like I don't remember what it was, that is sort of a sign, a sign for sure.
So you look at your clock and you thought it was 11 a.m. and suddenly it's 5 p.m. and you're thinking, where did the time go?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it like an out of body experience, or is it
Yeah.
you're so your mind is so racing that the time flies? And I
What
know
happens?
this is in general terms, right?
Yeah, yeah. So what you're exactly though. So dissociation is what you're describing, where and that's actually, maybe that's one of the words we could have defined, is just that your dissociation like literally means you are not associated, you're not present to your surroundings. So you're, and often that happens when it's so overwhelming, you're, it feels, it's too threatening, and you're, you know, it's not even conscious, right? Your brain, your body takes over, and you go away somewhere else. And you're not even present where you're going away to, right? Because when you return, you may find it's hard to say where you were. So it's not that you're, it's not only that you're absent from the present, it's even in the going away, it's not anything real, right? So people will say, yeah, okay, so I understand I wasn't here, but I don't know, I couldn't even where I was, right? So, which is a terrifying, but it happens in trauma for sure.
It's almost like a hiding place that your mind makes to deal with what's happening, it sounds like.
Yeah, because your brain and nervous system is out of whack, right? It impairs your capacity to inhabit your own body. So your mind escapes, which is sad, because think about it, like there's a disconnect, there's a separation of your mind and body. And so how do you then care for your body, for your current circumstances, if you're not there? So often what happens is, as people dissociate, they become more susceptible to further trauma, because they're not there to sort of be thinking strategically or respond in ways that they may have to, yeah.
So I don't want to miss this moment. Let's dive into that. So you're saying
Okay.
when you're unknowingly sort of hiding, and understandably hiding within your mind, disassociating when you're not 100% in reality, what's happening then is other traumatic events are happening around you, but whereas usually you would, I don't know, if there's electricity, maybe you would turn the TV off if there's news coming in. Or maybe if you're outside seeing traumatic occurrences, maybe you would close your door or whatever it may be, because you're sort of stepped away from reality then. You're not of your faculties to make these movements, to shield yourself from further trauma, therefore having further trauma.
Right. Because exactly, you said it perfectly. Trauma begets trauma. It makes us more vulnerable to further trauma. It's not, which is, I know I mentioned complex trauma earlier, and that's actually what that is when a person is experiencing multiple traumas at the same time. So they're compounding. An example of that would be, we're just getting reports, unsurprisingly, that women are being raped during the war, right? So there's war, you're fleeing for your life, and then there's other level of trauma and your body's being violated. So not all trauma is equal, obviously, right? But to be mindful that those with complex traumas are going to need that much more support because their traumas are many.
Oh, yeah. And I know we spoke while in preparation for our conversation here, and we want to let people know that the last thing we want this conversation to be is triggering for you. And yet it would be so inauthentic not to call things as they are. And we all know what's happening. So it wouldn't serve us to attempt to serve you in trying to sugarcoat things. And so having said that, what are some ways an individual right now dealing with what we've just described, what are some ways she or he, because they're not in the space of the luxury of looking away, obviously, because they could be experiencing it firsthand. Because right now that's what we're talking about, the individuals experiencing it firsthand and understanding the limitations, right? What are some ways this person can start to care for their mental health and against trauma?
Yeah. And I really appreciate your sort of giving that warning about, I realize in naming some of the atrocities that are happening, that it can be difficult for people to be present. So yes.
And I appreciated you bringing that up while we were, talking about this the other day, because, we want to help. And so we have to say these things, and yet it can be triggering, but I'm glad you brought that to my attention even. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's important. It's a hard one as far as what can someone who is in the moment experiencing trauma do to cope better.
And it takes me back to some of the things you mentioned, where though it may be hard to think this way, but taking care of your body right now, taking care of the things that are within your control. I remember you saying drinking water,
right
those.
And assuming, right, because we don't, there's still so much we don't know about what's accessible, right? Assuming that there's water readily accessible, yes, always make sure you're hydrated, right? Sleep if you can. But I want to maybe just pull back a little and say, I think the most important thing when there's so much that's outside of your control is to acknowledge that there's so much outside of your control, right? I think in trauma, it's not uncommon for people to like go into shock or denial or rationalize or just anything to sort of make it digestible what's happening. Um, and I think it's also when it's prolonged trauma, it can be hard to continue to use those defenses. So I would say to be kind to yourself and remember that all is not lost. Like all may be lost, outside externally when we're thinking about all the losses upon losses, but that there's still power within you to one for the fact that you are one of the survivors. You've made it, and that's important to hold on to, right? That let that be have purpose and let that have meaning, and to genuinely extend kindness to yourself, and say, this is really hard. This is absolutely, no one should have to go through any of this, and there isn't much I can do about it. And so to not berate ourselves, intentionally or otherwise around maybe I shouldn't be depressed, I shouldn't be grieving, I shouldn't I should be thankful. All these shoulds that can come in, like someone's, there are people who didn't make it here, and it's not helpful to turn on ourselves. So to sort of just be mindful about what we're saying to ourselves about the impact that it's having on us. I would be very concerned if someone were in war and all of what that comes with, and they were just fine, right? Or presenting as fine, because wait, there's a disconnect here. This is not the response isn't what you would expect or what is appropriate for the level of trauma that they're facing. So just to extend grace and kindness.
As a community, we are so great at extending grace and kindness to other people, to each other, to family members, to our extended community. But that's such an important thing to say. It sounds like right now, as you're maybe hearing us, to stop and say, this is a traumatic experience that I'm going through. And more than likely, I am experiencing trauma. And I'm not myself. And it's not okay that it's happening to you, but it's okay that you're not acting as normal. No one, So then what I heard you say in that is that to be first and foremost your own ally. Is that right? To be your own advocate, to be
your own advocate.
Right, for you.
Mm-hmm. And against yourself.
Right.
Because I don't think, let's hope, actually, I should say, that no one is, being critical of you in this time of year.
Right.
But often we are our own worst critics.
Correct.
So to sort of create some distance from that voice and say, surely no one, I can't expect myself to go about things the way I normally would if this weren't happening.
Right. Immediately, I think about mothers and caregivers in any other sense, fathers who are also in the caregiver roles, aunts and uncles. That is such an important thing to, and we're sitting here and just praying to be of help and to be a voice that maybe you're not hearing right now. And in saying that,
mm-hmm.
to that grace, I believe that you spoke of comes into where you say, I know I am giving care. I know that I have these lives that I'm responsible for, and still it's not okay what's happening to me. It's not okay what's happening to us, but it's okay that I'm not at 100%. And I think especially with children watching on, we're teaching our children what it means to deal with trauma. And for that person or persons you mentioned earlier who are unknowingly even maybe are saying, everything's fine, everything is fine. We're definitely not doing our children any favors. That is trauma, general to the individual. What is trauma in the collective sense, collective trauma look like? How does it show up, I should say?
Hmm. So just, as it sounds, it's a trauma that's experienced by many. So as opposed to the individual where, you know, within the collective, there are so many individual traumas, right? So, but the collective is like Tagadas right now are in danger. They're very much at risk, and there's talk that this is very much resembling genocide, and like that's the collective experience. All of the Tagados back home are experiencing that together. So that's collective trauma. And then those of us who are here, Tagados of the diaspora, we're also experiencing collective trauma because that's our people, right? And so to see them go through that, uh, most of us, half of us, are, if not all, are not new to war, right? Like we may have our own experiences. Like I mentioned, I came to the U.S. as a result of war, as a refugee. So there is this sort of general sense of angst. We're all like bated breath. We don't know what to do. Collective trauma is felt and understood because it's, I guess one way that I can talk about it is when a certain group is like when there's trauma that's specific to a certain group. So that's just on the base level, that's what collective trauma would be. Like in the US, there may be, there's the Black Lives Matter movement is speaking to racial trauma for Black Americans, right? So generally so we're experiencing trauma
On the ethnic level.
Yeah, at the ethnic level in our own country.
Truly. And so we are such a communal people, a society, community. Right now, with COVID and the inability, and just speaking with the greater diaspora, I would say usually when something remotely of this nature is happening, we would be quick to call each other, to go to each other's homes, to, especially, and unfortunately with news of people having passed on due to this tragedy, we would be quick to visit someone, to sit with them as a community, as a family. Right now, with that not being possible, how are we within the greater diaspora trying to deal with this? I guess I'm skipping ahead to our secondhand trauma that we will be discussing, but it's almost, they're so, you can't speak on one without the other, right? That's what we were saying the other day. How are we dealing with this secondhand trauma that we're hearing about together but separately? What does that look like to try to navigate through during a time where you can't come together?
Yeah, that is another layer to this, right? Because here we are having this collective experience where our people are being killed and having to flee and all the terrible things of which we only know a portion, right? Because
Bilen, sorry. I think there's a slight, if you can hear me, there's a slight connection. I'll just wait for you to rejoin. Okay.
Wait, I don't know if can you hear me?
No, yes. I left you at some of which we may only know.
Yeah, some of which we may only know. And so saying that we're not able to go to each other's houses, right? We're not able to gather at community centers, all the sort of traditional ways of communing. And so that's another layer that's just making this that much more difficult and painful, and we all feel isolated. But I wanted to say, was the question around how do we then navigate it, or how are we navigating it? Okay, which I guess is, yeah. You know, for those of us who are on social media, able to find community there, and that's not obviously people of the older generation may not be online, and that's understandable, and some of that is to be expected. But so there's sort of the push, and what I've noticed is like this call to action. There's a lot of people that are like, let's get the word out, and that's one way that we're being in solidarity with them. I think in other ways, you know, I'll speak for myself. I don't know if I've had a decent night's of sleep since November 4th, and there's a part of me that's like, how can I sleep? You know, like, and that's not even like I'm making myself stay up, but the thought of what is happening back there. And so what can we do? I think we have to work with what we have currently, given that COVID is very much a real thing and want to follow CDC guidelines. I think, you know, like this, you and I are able to be in community virtually, you know, over the phone, even though it's kind of countercultural to us, right? As a community, we're very much face-to-face, occupied physical space together. But it's going to be all the more important to help people, you know, get connected to Zoom and FaceTime and any which way on the phone, just to let people know that we're in it together, because we know that we are, but we're not able to show up together. And there's protests. I know that's been one way that people have been gathering, and that's helpful, but not everyone can show up to those as well. You know, there are risks already for those who are already at greater risk for COVID. So to just be mindful so that we don't forget certain members of our community, right? Because we can say, we're getting together, we are talking, we're doing this, and who's not in the room, right? Who isn't able to participate. So to be mindful of each other and get creative about what that can look like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether we're bringing meals to each other, any number of things.
So someone just mentioned that actually on one of our weekly update calls. And in fact, that's what I'm hearing from you, is redefining what connecting within your community looks like, adapting to what we're dealt, and yet there's a way of taking it and making it something that I don't like to use the word control, but in this instance, I would say you're in control of how you reach out to people, and you're in control of how the perspective you end up having on this.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, talking about the greater diaspora, while we're doing our work to advocate for the voiceless right now, it's such a, you know, suddenly you have millions of brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles you never knew about, because that's what it means to get together and fight for you. So I just want to say that. So then, where does PTSD come in respect to this trauma that is faced by the individual, this trauma that's faced collectively, whether it be firsthand trauma or secondhand?
So, because by definition, PTSD is post the trauma, is after, and because we're in it right now, I think we're having trauma responses. And for those of us who have experienced this ourselves, right? And trauma isn't only, you know, specific to war, right? Even immigration itself, even if we're outside it, you know, it can be traumatic. There's many things that can happen along the way. So I will venture to say that our community does suffer from PTSD. I think it's something that we're not really good about acknowledging, but I think I'm encouraged because there's a bit of a shift that I think is happening. And so I know now, like, a lot of people on social media are talking about how their parents are triggered, right? And because they had these experiences that essentially were unresolved. And by unresolved, I mean they weren't processed, they weren't talked about, they weren't, you know, you have to name, you have to feel, you have to do all these things. And so I think in the diaspora, there's people who have been suffering from PTSD where now it's being activated and it's starting to feel like they're themselves in it, right?
So this is PTSD from past trauma,
From past trauma.
specifically things like the Derg War or
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah,
anything after that.
anything
90,
after that, or
yeah,
even pre that, you know, just
right,
thinking about all the things that can happen to, you know, a human being in this
right.
life.
So,
So,
and this is, I think, the second or third time we use the word triggered, which just to say something reminds you of something that is unprocessed, right? And it
yeah,
starts up feelings that are unresolved or feelings you've never dealt with before. So
right.
it's triggering you to have
Mhm.
voluntary or involuntary responses is what I think of when I
Yes,
think triggered.
absolutely. That's great. Another way, yeah, because trigger is such a buzzword now, but it's you become something gets activated in you.
Mm.
And maybe it was late, you know, they're sort of latent because sort of pushed it down and it's going about the business and the stuff of life. But it's hard to see some of what we're seeing, hearing what we're hearing about what's happening in Tigray, and then not not resonate with your own experiences. And so involuntarily that's showing up. And you know, and it may not necessarily be like you're having flashbacks. That can be one symptom, but it may just be that you have difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating, or you're more irritable. Um, you're like glued to the screen, you know, any number of things. And just to be mindful that, okay, I'm having some PTSD symptoms.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think about, I don't know the exact number, but by the amount of noise and collective um, will of, and work online, and again with calling officials and um, the amount of I think of right now, you know, trending, making our voices trend on Twitter, the sheer just making sure that our people's plight is heard. I think about that while I'm tweeting at night. I'm feeding my son, you know, and tweeting with one hand. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think about the scenes that are for me um, have become the new normal, and also speaking within groups that I'm in to, you know, just have our voices heard. Let people know what's going on. Let elected officials know what's going on. Press the United Nations on doing their jobs and put the information out there, because we've, you know, our community in Tigray has been blacked out. You know, no communications, most places, no light, you know, no banks, no voice,
Food,
and
no food.
no food, no water, you know, no filtered water, um, you know, bodily harm, everything that is wrong, everything that makes us angry and that makes us pray and that makes us cling on that much more to the night, hoping that like right now, then the sun is setting, that we're afraid the sun will rise and we'll have to go back to our normal jobs before one more tweet. You know, I think about that collective and how many times a day we say triggering words. I think about how many times a day we purposely look for content
Mm-hmm.
to put to light, you know, people who have passed, murdered, you know, people who, you know, these things so that we show the world what's going on, and then what that is doing to our psyche. Not that we will stop, because as long as this stuff is happening, we
Right.
continue on. And
Yeah.
still, in order for us to be effective in the near, you know, long run or in even the immediate future, what we're talking about is being cognizant of our mental health, and that if you're not allowing yourself to maybe put the phone down, if you feel that you need to continue doing what you're doing in your advocacy, do you think it might look like, okay, for this amount of time, then I won't be searching images. For this amount of time, I will be focusing on this part of the advocacy. And then I'll give myself this amount of time to focus on that part. I mean, how do we balance? Because,
Right.
you know, for many of us, there's no question, we will continue.
Right.
Our, you know, the voices
Yeah.
of our communities.
We owe it to our people, right? Like it's almost like it's not a choice. We're compelled. It's beautiful. It's devastating. It's necessary, unfortunately, and it is, but it's not without consequence, right? It's not. And so I appreciate you bringing that. And I think balance is key, right? Because we don't know how long this is going to go. Right. And it's gone far longer than we'd hoped already. One day is too long. And here we are, day 68, and counting. So to be mindful and to set boundaries, to be, you know, and that's something that takes practice, right? Like you're saying, maybe it's before bed, I don't do this, right? 2 hours before I go to bed, I'm just not checking the news, because studies show that all those images and you're taking that with you. It's part of your subconscious, and your sleep is being compromised if you sleep at all, right? And so to sort of have the long game in mind. And again, some days you may have more energy, or depending on what comes out, you know, you may feel that, okay, this has to get out. People need to see this, and it may make a difference. And so it's going to look really different for everyone, and everyone doesn't have the same capacity. You know, you're a mother. That's going to mean different things for you while you care for your child. And, you know, whereas someone else who maybe isn't will feel like, well, I don't have a responsibility, but their mental health and their capacity to engage trauma isn't unlimited, because they don't have, you know, a being to take care of a home. So to sort of realize it's a marathon, as they say, and so we'll need rest. The good thing about all this is, like, we're not going it alone. We have each other. We are in community. And so how do we trust that the work is going on? Right. Even if we sleep, that doesn't mean Tigray isn't getting any exposure, because there's people from different time zones at all times of the night who are also doing that. And in order to be effective, you know, we can only be as effective as we are, as we have the tools, which mean, you know, so rest, sleep, and even if it feels counterintuitive, or we feel guilty, it's okay for us to treat ourselves okay during this time. In fact, it's almost required, because there's so much trauma at play. Like, take a walk, watch a movie, take breaks, and understand that you're not abandoning anyone by doing so. In fact, you're making yourself a better warrior, a better advocate.
Well said. Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
I hear you say, don't feel bad. For some reason, when you say that, all that you've just said, what jumped out was don't feel bad, because there is that, just like there's that survivor's guilt. We talked about that day. People who are making it past the airport and coming to the States. I think about part of our community that are American citizens that have been able to come back to America, and how torn up and how, you know, split that they feel. I haven't seen one person come back. For the handful of people that I've seen come back, not one person has come back wanting to come back, if that makes sense. And there's that devastation in their faces, that I left my people there. It's not even my family anymore, because now, because of such adversity, such trauma, we're bonded, all of us. I don't know you, but I know you're my sister, you know? Right.
Exactly.
I've stopped asking for last names because it's just brother, sister,
Exactly.
and if
Yeah.
anything, not to sugarcoat it, but if anything were to come out of it, that is something. And that when this moment of trauma is over and we are able to collectively take our people under our wings and help in the healing and the rebuilding process, that is something that will have come out of this, is that we will know ourselves to be one people and
Yeah.
one family. So I hear you saying, if you are within the greater diaspora, right now, treat yourself means, and we know it means, try to get some rest so that you can wake up and be effective on whatever advocacy that you are doing.
Right.
Treat yourself means take a moment to call the people that are here, to have a conversation outside of, because you never know, that can inspire a new form of communicating what you're trying to communicate. And also your body and your mind need rest. You need, and whatever form that looks like. We get it no longer means treating yourself to a spa or something like that. We're not talking on that level of superficiality. It's what we're talking about is people breaking down for being able to turn on their water faucet, because that's what's happening right now. People,
Gosh.
people going to sleep with their babies next to them and breaking down because they know so many of our families don't have that luxury if they're alive at all. So when we talk about treat yourself right now, that's and then if you're able to beyond that, then really good for you. Don't feel guilty, because we're all on different levels of dealing with this trauma and this experience, and the only person judging you is yourself. Pretty much, right? I think we're sort of coming up on an hour, and
Are we? That was fast.
there's so much to unpack. And as you can tell, that I said it, the sun has gone down, and
Yeah.
I live in nature. And that's, the sun has gone down and it's signaling to me our hour is almost up. But I want to take just a moment in talking about what trauma may look like in our children that are either, both our children who are experiencing it firsthand back home, and also our children who are watching us experiencing it here and maybe confused. Children who are confused and asking why this person is doing this to me. Although I have a feeling, children back home in our communities are a little bit more savvy,
Right.
because they grew up maybe seeing, whereas some of us, even as adults here, we never, we thought it was one country until very recently. And you know what I mean? It's like, what is going on? But so if we could just speak to how traumatic the trauma may be showing up within children. How does it look? And again, this is a very general sense, but what are some signs that trauma is affecting?
Because it can tend to show up differently in children. So that's an important point to just sort of pause and think about. I think for children, because, and again, there's such a spectrum in age here that we're talking about, but typically they're not likely to say, I'm distressed, I'm afraid, and some may, but again, thinking in a general sense, often trauma symptoms show up in children as physical ailments, right? So they may complain about headaches, they may complain about tummy aches, they're eating more than typical or eating less than typical.
You would usually think eating less, but also just any abnormality in
any abnormality, because it's gonna, it depends on the particular kid, maybe the norm for them, and so some deviation of that. Acting out, maybe they're talking back more than usual, or they're overly withdrawn, or some risky behaviors. You're thinking about teens, they may be staying out later, or taking up substance use or something like that. So it's gonna, you want to be paying attention to the behavior more with kids, because they're not able to articulate, and also because they may not really understand what they're responding to. It may just be that they're watching their parent who is, clearly distressed and under a lot of, going through a lot of worry, and maybe is, somewhat absent, and unavailable to them. And so this is sort of how they cope, is they communicate their behavior, and they're trying to say some needs are going unmet for me, right? And so just to sort of watch for variations in behavior.
And well said. And obviously, with children of a particular age, having those conversations would be important. If their processing is, on a different level, then I think a lot of times as parents, or even, parents, godparents, if you have a child in your home or within calling distance, I think a lot of times we think we're shielding them, we're helping them, protecting them by not having these conversations. But later on, unfortunately, we find out that they've already had the thoughts, they've already reached out in some way, and sometimes, unfortunately, the wrong way, meaning to the people who may not have the right answers. So I think have those conversations with your children, with your nieces, nephews, godchildren. As a community, we are good about having these extensions of our family. So please do have those conversations. And for the little ones, the toddlers, the ones, I think about 5, 6, 7 years old, exactly what Bilin said, they're noticing the absentee. At the very least, they're noticing that mom is not all about me all the time. So giving them a reason,
right,
and why, even however you're comfortable with that.
Right. That's a good, definitely, because attachment is so important.
Right.
So
you don't want them to feel all of a sudden I'm being abandoned. So that's another trauma in the making without even,
oh, that's a good point, because as we know, children tend to blame themselves. The meaning they make of anything that is a change, that's gone for the worse, like parent being more distant or any number of things, is I caused it. Their development is not fully realized. And so it's very important to be reassuring. And also, children are more attuned and aware than we give them credit for, even especially this day and age. Information is everywhere. So I have little sisters who are like, why are people doing this to us? And are able to say that, and they may not know who the us is and who's our people, but they know that in Ethiopia, where we're from, there is turmoil. So to say, like, all right, so mommy is sad. There's a war happening back home. Right. It's not something. I think it's the withholding of information that tends to be more harmful than to share. Because when you can name it, then one, they know it's not them, and two, they don't feel confused because they may have heard something, and chances are they did, because conversations are happening around them, and also they may have accessed it themselves. So to sort of name it and say, and I'm here, avail yourself to them, use that as motivation, maybe to take a break from the processing and some of the legwork we're all trying to do.
Yeah. Perfect. I wish, there's so much more. And I hope you speak with me again. I hope
I'm happy to, anytime.
Thank you. I will hold you to that. It's very much worth noting that Ms. Bilin Araya has what looks to be, from just checking it out, a very beautiful book of poetry coming out in February. It's called Plenty.
Plenty.
From what I've read, very excited about it, because there is, it comes from us. It comes from one of us. It comes from these experiences. And especially in a time of what seems like very much lack, that word really spoke to me, into my heart,
Mm.
plenty. We're very much people of faith. I just, for myself, when I saw that, it was an affirmation that although right now we feel like we're in a time of lack, God is bigger. That's just my personal view. And
Amen.
whomever, whatever you believe in, don't forget to reach out to that power. And
Mm.
I look forward to reading the entirety of your book of very nuanced poetry. And how shall we end this? I mean, how should, you know, this collective feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood and um, how shall we end this?
Mm. You know, I'll say that when I was invited to show up and speak here, first of all, it's not something that I typically do, but the cause is so great that I thought, all right, I can be anxious and nervous about it, but I want to show up and I want to be here. And because you and I talked and I felt understood and seen by you, that compelled me all the more to show up. And so I think some of what's important to take away is that we are each other's greatest source of support, right? Because to be, Tagado is to know the singular experience that only we are all facing, and so to lean into each other, to be vulnerable, to risk being vulnerable with each other, and to say, like, I'm hurting, I'm so scared, everything feels so difficult, and to not see that as weakness or some kind of deficiency, because culturally we tend to, insist and emphasize on snapping out of it and not um, not letting things affect us and that sort of thing. But vulnerability is where we really meet each other. It's not enough to just be people from the same area and the same, ethnicity. It's really when we show up as who we are to each other. And so, I mean, that would be my charge. I hope, it is my hope, in the way that you and I have been sort of authentic and real in ourselves, both in our hopes and faith that Tigray will prevail, and that there is plenty ahead for us to celebrate as a people. That right now we're hurting, and it's scary, and it's okay, and out of that kind of being joined in our sadness and in our hurt, I think beautiful things will come out of that. We'll become more whole. That's a gift we can only give each other if we are being truly ourselves and being true to what's really happening for us.
What more is there to add to that? That's perfect. Thank you so much, Bilana Aya.
Thank you, Helena. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my honor. I'm Helena Tadessa. Thank you for joining us in this conversation on mental health. And indeed, Tigray will prevail. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.